You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 352, recorded on February 21st, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line, as always, from Idaho is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
And on the line from New York City is Kelley. Hi, Kelley.
Hey, Bill. Hi, Rachel.
So this week we're going to be talking about Helen Keller, and specifically how she was a radical leftist. We had been continually running into references to her in a lot of the prep work for other episodes that we had been doing. You might recall on our episode about Joe Hill that Helen Keller was one of the left-wing advocates for Joe Hill being cleared of the murder charges and so forth that he was convicted and executed for completely baselessly. And so we thought we would get into that a little bit more because Helen Keller, who passed away in 1968, probably a lot more recently than many people would think, the same year that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, gets a sanitized, officially approved treatment in schools, much in the way that Martin Luther King Jr. does. And we thought that was important to explore and get into a little bit more detail on. Much in the same way that MLK's views, while obviously quite political, are flattened into a much more sort of one-dimensional or two-dimensional at best view with occasional allusions to some of his left-wing political alignments. Helen Keller gets completely reduced to basically the miracle worker play and so forth. Her political views are almost never discussed at all. So that's what we're going to be focusing on in this week's episode. Now, one caveat that we'll address later in the episode was her brief dabbling in certain eugenics ideas that were popular with her contemporaries, but we'll also explain why that isn't really reflective of her views on the whole, particularly because she believed that socialism was the only solution to a better life for blind and deaf people. So Helen Keller comes from an affluent background in the American South. Her education was funded by Standard Oil tycoon Henry Huddleston Rogers, who she actually became linked to via Mark Twain, whose finances were handled by Rogers. And so you might think, based on that background, that she would not be a good candidate for radical political views, but she eventually did get pretty deep into that stuff. And she joined the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, after the 1912 Lawrence textile mill strike, which we covered in our 2019 episode on the rise of the IWW. And you might recall that the IWW in general became quite popular, as well as the cause of the strikers in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, because of the not only the way that the government and the mill owners responded to it, but also the strategy of shipping children from Lawrence to communities all over the Northeast to get them to places where people could take care of them and feed them while this brutal strike crackdown was happening. And this strategy helped raise awareness for the strike all over much of the United States. So it was a good recruitment tool in general for a lot of people, so she was not the only person to get involved in leftist causes as a result of that. But she explicitly supported the anti-electoral tendencies of the IWW and questioned parliamentary socialism, although, like many IWW people, she made exceptions for people like Eugene Debs when he was running for president, Debs himself being a co-founder of the IWW, and she supported him at least several times. I'm not sure if she supported every single time that he ran for president. And she was a co-founder of the ACLU toward the end of or just after World War I. A lot of people at least know that about her. That's like sort of the only political thing that really ever gets mentioned about her typically. Certainly a lot less common is to talk about the fact that she was pretty staunchly anti-war, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of that as we go through our readings and notes on this. And Keller frequently clashed with newspaper editors and publishers over her socialist views, especially as she became more vocal about those views, and the publishers and editors realized that she was serious and not joking around about them. So, Kelley, I'll go to you now that we've done this overview. What was your sort of takeaway on this, and where should we dive in on some of the ideas that Helen Keller was debating?
Sure. So this is not the Helen Keller that I learned about in grade school, and so it seems appropriate to revisit her, her true self and her true beliefs as we approach Women's History Month, something that doesn't get enough attention for sure. And one thing that really stood out to me was just really how sharp she was, how sharp her tongue was, and how committed she was to these beliefs. And I think that is particularly impressive when you consider where she came from. She was born in Alabama to a Confederate veteran and a plantation owner who had previously enslaved people. So she was really born into this deep South household and had in at a time of during the violent era of Reconstruction. And yet she sort of overcame that environment as well as her deafness and blindness in order to really become an advocate for working people and for leftist causes. So not only did she come from this Confederate background, but she really adopted leftist causes at her own, and for a few key reasons, one of which is connected to her disability itself. And I'm going to read a quote here. Keller identified her Marxist analysis and her socialism as deeply interconnected with her disability activism. As she studied economics, she visited factories and felt the very vibrations of the brutal industrial conditions that resulted in worker injuries. She concluded that the main causes of disability in the U.S. were industrial and workplace accidents and sickness from owners placing profits above worker safety. So despite the fact that her deafness and blindness was a result of an illness she had at a very young age, she came to believe and understand that most disabilities across the U.S. at the time were caused by these poor industrial conditions and workplace accidents. And so that was one contributing factor in her adopting of these leftist policies and socialist views. And the second piece that I just want to touch upon is that this was also connected to her relationship with Annie Sullivan's teacher. Annie Sullivan, of course, Annie Sullivan's husband. Annie Sullivan, of course, is the teacher who worked with Helen Keller for most of her life to help her initially communicate with the world and lead a fulfilling life. And so Sullivan's husband was John Macy, and he was a Harvard instructor and a social critic. Keller lived with Sullivan and Macy for many years and therefore sort of had access to these circles, these socialist circles, these texts. And she came to own copies of Marx and Engels and related texts in German Braille and sort of read them and adopt them and develop her own ideas. But her first exposure to many of these ideas was a result of her living with Sullivan and Macy for all those years. And so as she developed these views, both connected to her disability and just a result of her exposure to socialist circles through Macy and Sullivan, she really came to adopt and understand them as her own. And like I said up top, one of the things that really stood out to me was sort of her quick wit and clever tongue about these things. She once referred to Rockefeller as a monster of capitalism, which is something that we may consider relatively tame, given sort of the destruction that he wrought on the American people. But I think it does go to show that there's this whole other side of Keller that we don't talk about in history class in grade school. And she impressively continued to defend her leftist politics, even while communism was considered such a threat in the U.S. And she was aware, while she was alive and at a young age, that not everybody had an appetite for her activism. And she wrote a letter in 1924 to social reformer U.S. Senator Robert La Follette. And she wrote, "So long as I confine my activities to social service and the blind, they compliment me extravagantly, calling me archpriestess of the sightless, Wonder Woman, and a modern miracle. But when it comes to a discussion of poverty, I maintain that it is the result of wrong economics, that the industrial system under which we live is the root of much of the physical deafness and blindness in the world. that is a different matter. And so she almost, I think, foretells what her legacy would be when she died more than 40 years later, that there was a real desire for her to be this, this sort of miracle worker, this embodiment of a can-do attitude and persistence, and yet there was much less appetite for her to develop her own ideas and views on the world. Another example of her sort of quick wit in activism was a letter that she wrote in 1933 to German students, in which she learned that they would be burning copies of her books. And so she wrote a letter to the student body of Germany, and I will share just an excerpt here. History has taught you nothing if you think you can kill ideas. Tyrants have tried to do that often before, and the ideas have risen up in their might and destroyed them. And so we, of course, look at 1933 Germany with hindsight, but even at the time, Helen Keller knew that this was a bad sign that they were burning her books, and she said something about it, and she wrote to them. And so I think that is another impressive example of her activism. And her activism was not without consequence. She was under surveillance of the FBI for most of her adult life. And she was named as a communist in an FBI report, along with other prominent Hollywood and cultural figures at the time. So while we now remember her as sort of a simplistic figure, at the time she was quite complicated. And as she noted herself, people had much more appetite for her sort of simple story rather than the depths of her understanding of economics and politics.
I thought it was interesting in that letter to the German students that were planning to burn her books that she alluded to her sort of anti-war internationalism as well. She said, "You can burn my books and the books of the best minds in Europe, but the ideas in them have seeped through a million channels and will continue to quicken other minds. I gave all the royalties of my books for all time to the German soldiers blinded in the World War, with no thought in my heart but love and compassion for the German people." She also talked in the letter as well about the barbarities against the Jews by the Nazi Party and condemned that. And I thought that was interesting. It was unusual views from the previous period and forward-thinking and vocal views in the early part of the Nazi period as well. Rachel, I wanted to go to you now to go over some of the readings that you did and some of the interesting points that you ran across.
Yeah, I found an International Socialist Review article. It is very, very comprehensive and really goes through the whole of Helen Keller's life. Like Kelley said, she really was kind of trotted out as like inspiration porn almost, like, oh, what a miracle worker. Like she's like, it's like they said, the high priestess of the sightless. But whenever she did publicly come out with her socialist views, then the newspapers kind of turned against her really quickly. The Detroit Free Press wrote about her in 1914. As long as Miss Keller appears before the public in the light of a member of society struggling nobly under great handicaps and furnishing by her example inspiration for others who are unfortunately placed, she does a valuable work. But the moment she undertakes to speak ex cathedra, as it were, of all the political and social problems of the day, she receives a consideration out of all proportion to her fund of knowledge and judgment. Helen Keller, struggling to point the way to the light for the deaf, dumb, and blind, is inspiring. Helen Keller preaching socialism, Helen Keller passing on the merits of the copper strike, Helen Keller sneering at the Constitution of the United States. Helen Keller under these aspects is pitiful. She is beyond her depth. She speaks with the handicap of limitation which no amount of determination or science can overcome. Her knowledge is, and must be, almost purely theoretical, and unfortunately this world and its problems are both very practical. So they just dismissed her experiences like out of hand, that she couldn't possibly understand these political and economical realities because she was disabled.
I think that, Kelley, you noted in your notes for this episode that she actually did have quite a lot of not only firsthand exposure to these type of factory problems, but also that she had read up on a lot of theory, right?
Yeah, exactly. She came to know and be an advocate for disabilities beyond her own, and through her research and through her visiting of factories and getting involved in these strikes, came to understand that the primary cause of disability was actually industry and poor working conditions itself, which of course is different than the illness that caused her specific disability.
And she was able to read German Braille too, right? So she read Marx and Engels in the original or translated original German, right?
Yeah, exactly. Sort of a fascinating fact about her that she could read German Braille, but she owned these texts in German Braille, Marx, Engels, other socialist texts, and she owned them and read them in German.
Yeah. Another facet of disability was women who had to do survival sex work, and frequently they contracted syphilis, and that caused blindness. So she was very committed to all working class people, no matter what industry or profession they had to work in. And that kind of ties into something that people have denounced her for. They claim that she upheld eugenicist ideas. She was influenced by her friend and then comrade Margaret Sanger of Planned Parenthood fame and family planning fame.
Or infamy, as the case may be.
Exactly. From this article, one recent Keller biography written by disability studies professor Kim Nielsen advances a number of important criticisms of Keller's disability politics. She correctly condemns an article written by Keller in 1915 during a brief moment when she had adopted certain eugenicist ideas. Influenced greatly by her friend and then comrade Margaret Sanger, Keller conflated the struggle for birth control and reproductive self-determination with the broader social goal of ensuring the, quote, fitness of future generations. To be fair, Keller never supported the more odious and racist aspects of eugenic philosophy, such as forced sterilization, a practice legalized by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1927. In any event, within a matter of years, Keller was writing articles denouncing the entire survival of the fittest mentality upon which eugenics was founded, not only in Nazi Germany, but in the United States as well. She never really meant for it to be taken to the extreme of forced sterilization. And I think her views are somewhat exaggerated to kind of score points against her. It seems like this has definitely been blown out of proportion. And she definitely was an advocate for disabled people and was really about improving their quality of life and ensuring that they did have a whole, complete life. Also from the article, Keller was a Christian socialist. She adopted the philosophy of Manuel Swedenborg, who saw the Bible as more allegorical than historical. And the highest goal of Christianity was to improve humanity's condition on earth while still believing in an immortal soul. So she wrote that she believed that the essence of the gospel was, quote, the supreme and equal worth of each individual soul. She insisted there is no peace between the teachings of Christ and any form of slavery, which is especially pointed given her background and where she grew up. I think this type of Christianity was really seen as kind of heretical, especially in the views of man's place in the world, especially in a capitalist society. Like some men are greater than others, or as Joe Hill wrote, you'll see your pie in the sky in the afterlife. But this strain of Christianity really saw as its goal like improving humanity's conditions on Earth. So it was definitely a different strain, and I think we don't really see a lot of Christian socialists. Kind of the dominant strain is kind of an atheistic socialism. So it's really interesting to read her views on Christian socialism. Her most active years were definitely the 1910s and the 1920s. They're kind of written about as, quote, her socialist years. An interviewer asked her in 1916, what are you committed to, education or revolution? Revolution, Keller replied. We can't have education without revolution. We have tried peace education for 1900 years and it has failed. Let us try revolution and see what it will do now. I'm not for peace at all hazards. I regret this war, talking about World War I, but I've never regretted the blood of the thousands spilled during the French Revolution. And the workers are learning how to stand alone. They are learning a lesson they will apply to their own good out in the trenches. Under the obvious battle waging, there's an invisible battle for the freedom of man. So like you said, Bill, she was very anti-war. She was against the war in World War I. She was also initially against U.S. intervention in World War II. However, when Nazi Germany started invading Russia, she, as a loyal communist, saw that as the line that was crossed, and then she did support the war. However, she was really against the brutality of U.S. involvement, especially in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. She did visit those sites. She went to Japan frequently. She had a lot of supporters in Japan. And when she visited the sites, she really realized the horrors that the U.S. Visited upon Japan. And she really came to regret her support for the war later. In her later years, she also decried the imperialism of post-World War II USA, and she spoke out against McCarthyism and anti-communist fervor. She turned her support away from Soviet Russia toward third world countries asserting their independence, such as the newly independent India. She also started to distance herself from her former pro-Soviet views. She saw the Cold War as the fault of both the USA and the USSR. And in her later years, she never really fully turned her back on socialism, but she started to consider herself a non-communist. Many of her biographers that talk about this time seem to imply that she kind of became a liberal in her later years, but she never embraced capitalism, and she always considered herself a socialist. She wrote in 1950, "I've never had a tolerant view of the character, objectives, and flaws of capitalism, and I fear I am incorrigible. A very few of the rich whom I meet appeal to me eloquently and are ready to surrender their all for the good of humanity if need be, but I've never felt close to them even before I became a socialist." So I just wanted to point that out because it seems like a lot of biographers talk about her quote socialist years and don't really talk about how she evolved in her later years. Her health started failing in the late 1950s and 1960s, and the American Federation for the Blind had power of attorney over her. They owned the house she lived in. They really restricted who she could see or who could even visit her because they did own her house. They started to control her life more and more, especially after the death of her companion, Annie Sullivan. So I think in her later years, she really lost control of her life, and I think that really ties into the disability activism that kind of came up after her death in the 1970s. Like, her life was controlled, and she was basically institutionalized, and she really didn't want to see that happen to other disabled people. So I think she really kind of was on the forefront of the disability rights movement that kind of popped up after her death.
I think that notion as well of people in her life sort of kind of trying to control her is an important one as well to understanding some of her political views and development. Obviously, like I said at the beginning, people know Helen Keller from the play The Miracle Worker, but even that doesn't really give you a full picture of who Annie Sullivan was either. And as Kelley noted, Annie Sullivan's husband was connected to all of these sort of radical left-wing thinkers and intellectuals as well, and kind of that gave Helen Keller access to a political circle. Sullivan also, was influential in freeing Helen Keller to pursue all sorts of avenues and explore things and develop intellectually and politically. And many of the times when her life was most restricted and least autonomous was when she was not being helped by Sullivan, or if Sullivan had passed away. We were talking before that we recorded that may have also influenced her sort of brief, as I said, dabbling with the eugenics views that were popular at the time. It wasn't just, about being friends with Margaret Sanger. It was also maybe the fact that when she tried to get married herself and was no longer under the protection of Annie Sullivan, her parents had stepped in and sort of broken up that relationship and prevented her from getting married on the basis that people with disabilities shouldn't get married, or at least potentially, hereditary disabilities, shouldn't get married. And that, I think, is a good example of a time in her life where she lost some, autonomy to somebody else. And, then that, maybe she had sort of internalized some of that and, briefly had a little flirtation with some of those views and then sort of repudiated that when she was back able to be, under her own authority or under somebody else's protection that wasn't trying to control her life. Who knows, just sort of speculation on my part, but I thought that was worth bringing up. Kelley, I'll go back to you now.
Sure. And I think what really strikes me as we talk about her life story is the way her views continue to evolve and really were her own. I think everything from like the Christian socialism, which is, wasn't like the most common brand of socialism, to sort of like trying to find where she fit in on the spectrum between like socialism and communism, and seeing how her thoughts evolve throughout her life cycle. It's just like such a human thing that we all experience. And I think like just captures the complexity of being a human and a human with a political identity. And so I think that I'm still sort of like in awe of and have like great respect for that journey that she went on. And I really wish that we did more to appreciate and celebrate her contributions as, a human and a thinking political human.
How do you think Helen Keller should be taught in schools? I mean, you're on the education policy side of things, but, obviously you have to always flatten things a little bit to get through your curriculum, but clearly the view of Helen Keller is a deliberate sort of abridging of her history in a very specific way. I think, again, similarly to what we see with Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about like the point of teaching Helen Keller should be to like raise awareness of disabilities and what people with disabilities can accomplish, to sort of show that they are like very much an integral part of our society. And so while we can't go into like the different like perspectives on socialism in a third grade curriculum necessarily when people meet Helen Keller, I do think that we should be teaching kids that she did have a political identity. She was fighting for these social causes that were controversial at the time, and she developed her ideas through her own analysis of economics and through sort of exposure she had to relationships from her companion Annie Sullivan. I think that, like, again, if the point is to show what a person with a disability can accomplish, then we really do a disservice to the disability community by not celebrating Helen Keller's political contributions and sort of stopping the story at the fact that she like learned how to like signal for water with her companion Annie Sullivan. I think by not exploring the richness of her adult life, we lose out on an opportunity to really show kids how people with disabilities contribute to our society.
Yeah, like Kelley said, we kind of stopped the story very early, and someone pointed out that there's like statues of her at like 7 years old. So I think she's kind of in our minds trapped in amber as a child, and that really doesn't show the fullness of her life. I think even children can learn about her disability activism talking to workers that were like injured on the job. I don't know. You obviously can't really graphically point it out, but I think you can point out that working conditions at the time weren't great and that people were injured as a result of that. And also, I don't think I knew that she wrote all these books and all these works. So I think that's something that kids can learn as well. The fact that she was just so prolific. I think she had a pretty regular newspaper column. She did have a full active political life, and I think that's something that really gets missed in teaching about her. And a lot of the focus is on Annie Sullivan for good reason. She was a very great teacher, But I think that really takes away a lot of the agency from Helen and kind of gives all the kudos to Annie Sullivan.
Well, to your point about the curriculum, I was thinking as you were talking, and I'm sure Kelley's going to back me up on this, the Massachusetts grade school curriculum does include fairly graphic depictions of industrial life in Massachusetts. The Lowell Mill strikes and so forth is a big part of the curriculum in the schools in Massachusetts, even at the elementary level. And I think it's made pretty clear some of the horrifying child labor conditions and conditions for the adult workers. And so, again, that feels more like a thematic extension to tie that into the Helen Keller stuff rather than being some sort of an outlier.
Exactly. I mean, Massachusetts has a rich history of industrial labor and poor protections for workers, and so certainly I think it fits into that vision, that lesson plan as well. I remember I remember a lot of pictures from textbooks that are coming back to me now as we discuss this. I also am a product of the Massachusetts state curriculum.
Yeah, that's something that doesn't really get talked about in Idaho history. We have a much shorter, more like pioneer vision of our history, I guess, less industrialized. So I think we don't really get to learn a lot about the Industrial Revolution as much in elementary school history. And that definitely comes later on in probably like more like high school history.
All right. Well, Rachel, thank you for being on the show this week.
It's always a pleasure, Bill.
And Kelley, thank you for being here as well.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks to both of you for doing all the research on this Helen Keller leftism episode. Don't forget as well, people, to subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/Arsenal for Democracy, where we have a bonus episode each week for $5 a month subscribers. Thank you.